We are talking with filmmaker Deborah Koons Garcia. She is the writer, director, and producer of the new film, The Future of Food. Start out and tell us, what was the motivation in putting together your film, The Future of Food?
Well, I became a vegetarian in college back in the late 60s, early 70s, and I started learning about the difference between what we call now sustainable agriculture and industrial agriculture, and not only what it does to the earth, but what it does to people's bodies. So it's something that I've been aware of for many years and really kept up on. I'm kind of like this food fanatic, I'm like, luckily I live in Marin County, California, so I can eat good organic food year-round, so I'm very fortunate. And I had always thought that it would be great to make a film that explained these issues to the average person. So I decided a few years ago that maybe this was the time to make the film. I wanted to do a really serious project, like someone that was a really absorbing project. And when I started researching it, I thought, well, now I'll do the film about agriculture and pesticides and organochlorines and xenoestrogens. I thought it was going to be about one thing, but when I started researching it, genetic engineering was obviously the big issue, that they were genetically engineering seeds and plants and to be resistant to herbicides, and they were genetically engineering insecticides to be in plants, and also patenting. And so these issues that I didn't know anything about, even though I felt like I was a very well-educated, hypervigilant consumer, it had just happened under the radar. And so it became clear that I should make the film just because I wanted people to know about it, and also because no one knew about it. Even now, there's a lot in the film besides genetic engineering, but that's a big component of it because that's such a big change. I think it's a big change. The proponents of genetic engineering say it's exactly the same. I think it's really different. So that's one of the points of the film. But so I think that people it sort of came in under the radar, and right now only 30% of Americans think they've ever eaten genetically engineered food. And if they eat corn syrup or lecithin, which is in a lot of processed foods, they most likely they have. So that, and then when they find out that they have eaten it and it's not labeled, they're outraged. I mean, that's what the government focus groups that have, they've done on this issue say, that the citizens are outraged. So I just think people need to wake up and look at the changes that are happening in the food system and before it's too late.
So talk a bit more about the degree to which genetically modified organisms have been integrated into our food. I was surprised, and I follow this, I was surprised in your film that it's like 100 million acres.
Yeah, more than that now. Yeah, it's all over, but it's only in a few countries. Most of it's grown in the U.S. and Canada and, of course, China. There are just a few countries because Europe doesn't want it, Japan doesn't want it, but the four main crops that are genetically engineered are cotton, corn, soy, and canola, and some Hawaiian papaya. Those are the only crops, and a couple different kinds of squash that aren't really readily available. Those are the only crops that are for sale for people to eat that are genetically engineered. And 85% of the soy grown in America today is genetically engineered, and about 45% of the corn. So we all know that corn syrup is in so many things, and corn syrup is kind of a controversial issue right now anyway, with diabetes and all these things that are happening in health that people are wondering, where is it coming from? So basically, so we have this in our food, and they're genetically engineered in two ways that are available for sale. There are lots and lots of test plots, and we can talk about that later because that's its own outrage. But basically, they're genetically engineered with a bacteria. It's recombinant DNA technology, which uses DNA from bacteria and viruses to cross species boundaries, and they put bacteria into these cells. And one thing they do is called Roundup Ready plants, and they're genetically engineered with a bacteria that's naturally resistant to Roundup, which is Monsanto's herbicide. So when these are Roundup Ready, genetically engineered with this bacteria, you can spray them with Roundup over and over and over again, and they won't die. It will kill everything else green, but it won't kill those plants. So it helps the farmer with weeding, so it's fast, even though it's more expensive because there's a premium on it. You have to buy the chemical, buy the seeds, have a premium on the chemical. It's fast, and so some farmers like that because they're pushed for time, because they usually have to have off-farm jobs, or they don't have the kind of help they used to have. The other one is BT crops, and BT is a natural bacterial insecticide, and it's organic farmers use it, and they put it on their plants if it's needed, once a season. In this case, this bacterial insecticide that kind of dissolves insects from the inside out, the target insect, is genetically engineered into every cell of those plants, so that if a corn borer, which is one of the target insects, eats any part of that corn plant, it will die. So if you're eating, and actually the BT crops are registered with the EPA as an insecticide because this is in every cell. So if you're eating this corn, you're getting this insecticide in every cell. So it's a really different kind of thing than using BT, for example, to spray it once a season to get rid of certain pests. So those are the two things that are available for us to eat. And then there's a lot of test plots all over the place that are proprietary, so citizens don't know where they are, and there are all kinds of crops that they're testing. And one of the things that is most alarming is this thing called farming. PHARMING. You're looking at me, you've got this look on your face like, oh no. This is so funny because we're right around Thanksgiving, so everybody's thinking about food. Look at their plates and think, well, if it's not organic and you're eating corn, cotton, soy, canola, you might want to know that, what might be in there. But the farming plants are crops like corn or rice that are genetically engineered to create a chemical or a plastic or a vaccine, and these plants create that. And this is supposed to be a benefit because it gives farmers that would grow that crop added value. And it was supposed to be cheaper than manufacturing the plant. Spermicidal corn, they were testing that in Southern California, and apparently the, I think this is the story, the company that was testing it went bankrupt. So I always imagine there's kind of like all this spermicidal corn pollen floating all around Southern California. And this is bizarre, I could talk about this on this radio station, but how they made the spermicidal corn is certain women's bodies are allergic to sperm. It's just a condition. And so what they've done is they've taken that and genetically engineered that into the corn. And there's also this this rice that's genetically engineered with the human gene that creates breast milk in order to create a pharmaceutical that cures diarrhea. That's another one. They're growing test plots of that in Hawaii, in North Carolina, right next to it. So there is all kinds of stories about those things that you probably rather not hear. But it's good to know because it's all happening. And that's the problem a lot of people have with genetically engineered plants, is that you can't contain them, and that they cross with other plants, and that they can spread, and they can contaminate other grains that are processed with them. And so that's what has a lot of people concerned, is not only that they're out there in the food supply, but that they're not labeled in the United States. So we can't choose unless you're buying organic, unless you have the opportunity and the ability to buy organic.
And even there, as we speak, they're working on trying to reduce the laws on organic foods.
Yeah, well, they're trying to degrade the organic standards, which is a whole other controversial issue. And they did try when they were establishing what the organic standards were back in the early 90s, what the government, and the Organic Standards Board, as it is now, is a bunch of different kinds of people. People in the organic industry, and they're not. It's not a government board that's appointed by. It's not a political favors board. There actually are, right now, the way it stands, there are people that are very interested in keeping organic standards pure. But what's happened now is that they're trying to open those up again and change them, and it has a lot of people alarmed because everyone worked really hard to keep these standards high. And what they wanted back in the early 90s is that the government said that they wanted to allow food to be labeled organic if it had been grown with sewage sludge, or if it was genetically engineered, or if it had been irradiated. And everyone that wanted organic standards to be pure and high, everyone wrote in to the FDA, and I think there were 250,000 people wrote in. I wrote in. And so they did take those out of the standards. So fortunately, it can't be called organic if it's been irradiated or if it's genetically engineered. But this new thing of opening it up, there's some problems with it. It's a controversial issue because some organic growers think, some people in the organic food industry think they can open up and let a few things that people use for processing that are pretty harmless go through. But then a lot of other people have the concern that once it's opened up, then big industry, and organic now is a very lucrative industry. So Walmart's grows organic, it's all big biz now. So they want to get in there, and people are afraid they'll want to degrade the standards and kind of take what people think of as organic. You kind of think of this nice, happy, small family farm, and there are lots of wonderful farmers who do grow that. But then there's also massive industrialized organic agriculture now. And, there are some wonderful dairies that have organic milk that are lovely family dairies that treat the cows well. And then there's other organic dairies that keep them all in sheds, and it's kind of a sort of a factory farm situation. And it says in the Organic Standards Act that they're supposed to have access to pasture. Well, some of these big corporations that are doing organic stuff now, access to pasture to them means the cows can look out and see a pasture. Which I don't think that's what the cows, I don't think that's the same for the cows. That's not really the same.
If they have their way, they'll just, they'll put up a photo of a pasture.
Yeah, right. They'll put up a photo, right, a Xerox of a pasture.
So talk about one of the people that features prominently in your film, Percy Schmeiser.
Yeah, Percy Schmeiser. Percy Schmeiser is a farmer in Saskatchewan, Canada, and he's now in his mid-70s. And about in the late 90s, he was growing canola. He's been a farmer for over 50 years. He dropped out of school during World War II when he was a teenager to grow food, to help feed the troops. And so he's been a devoted farmer his whole life. And what happened, he's a canola farmer, and he's a seed saver. So through the years, he's collected up seeds that work well for his fields in Saskatchewan, and then he replants them. And what happened in the late 90s is he got a letter from Monsanto saying that he had planted that they had found their patented Roundup Ready canola on his land, and that therefore he had breached they had violated their patented seed. That you can patent seeds now, and that he owed them money. And he said no. He refused to pay because he didn't plant it. He didn't want it there. And his position was this got on his land somehow. He didn't know how. His next door neighbor was growing it. Stuff fell off a truck. He didn't know, but he didn't plant it there. He didn't want it there. So he figured he shouldn't have to pay. And the early courts ruled against him, and they ruled against him in the first court and the appeals court and all the way to the Supreme Court. And they said that it didn't matter how it got on his land, but he had violated Monsanto's patent. And so Percy's a great hero. He's gone all over the world speaking, and he's, a lot of farmers get these letters, and they all settle because they don't want to go up against Monsanto. And also because the way that the law is now, if you're growing corn and your neighbor's growing genetically engineered corn and their pollen comes over and contaminates your corn, you're violating the patent of the company that owns the patent on that corn. You don't want it there. It damages your market because a lot of people don't want GE corn. So that the ruling in Canada, the Supreme Court, which came down last year, was interesting because they told Percy, because Monsanto wanted damages from him. They wanted not only for him to pay his $400,000 of legal fees, but their legal fees and then damages to them. And what the Supreme Court said, which was interesting in Canada, they said that you can't patent a higher life form. That's what the Canadian Supreme Court ruled. Now, in America, there was a test case that came up. The Harvard mouse is genetically engineered to have a predisposition to cancer called the onco mouse, the Harvard mouse. And it was the first animal that was patented. So it went all the way up to Supreme Court. U.S. said, yes, you can patent the Harvard mouse. Went all the way up to Supreme Court in Canada. They said, no, you cannot patent the Harvard mouse because it's a higher life form. So in this way, even though our court systems are similar, they're different. So everyone was watching the Percy case to see if they were going to declare plants higher life forms or not. So what they said, which was interesting, the ruling was that the plant wasn't patented, but the DNA that Monsanto had patented, what was patented, and that is in every cell of the plant. But the plant itself is not patented, but their DNA is still patented. So if they have their DNA in the plant, then you're violating the patent. Because it's interesting to think how, the plant can be patented, although the DNA is in every cell and the DNA is patented. And so that's the whole issue of patenting life, and should life be patented. And so what they said to Percy was that he would not owe Monsanto, he would only owe Monsanto money for the increased value that this patented DNA brought to those plants, which was zero, because people don't want it. They can't sell it. So he didn't owe them money, and they also said that he should pay his legal fees and they should pay their legal fees. So as Percy says, they didn't get 1 red cent out of me. So it was a mixed, they did reaffirm the patent breach, but there were these other sort of side things that were kind of mixed. And Percy, the thing about Percy is that he's the most famous farmer in the world now. He's a huge hero to farmers in places like India, and he's a very colorful, very bright man, because we spent several days with him, and I've seen him many times, and he's spoken on panels after the film, and his wife Louise, they're just really great. They have a bunch of kids and a bunch of grandchildren. They're just completely salt of the earth. But you kind of wonder, why did Percy go up against Monsanto when all these other farmers didn't? And one reason was that Percy, for many years, represented his province in the Canadian legislature, the parliament. I guess it's a parliament there. And so he always felt, all those years that he represented Saskatchewan, that he was there for the farmers, that he was there to protect farmers. And so I think that just colored his whole outlook. So, and all of his farming, there was this sense of service. Growing things during World War II, and, he had to stay there and grow things and all this kind of thing. There's this sense of there's a calling, a higher calling with Percy and farming and the land. And so he felt that when this happened to him, that this was a bad thing for all farmers. And I think that habit of his, of all those years of trying to think, how does this affect the farmer? How does this affect farmers? So he had this kind of different point of view, and also because he had been in the legislature and he had dealt with law and he had dealt with all this stuff, that he was more likely, he was willing to take it on. And so it's good because, Monsanto's, we don't even know how many these letters Monsanto has sent out to farmers, many thousands. And it's really a sad situation because farmers, a lot of farmers, but what can you do? You're going to either give them the money they want, $80,000, $100,000, $25,000, whatever they want, or else you're going to face years of litigation. And the other interesting thing that I learned recently, it's all the news is sort of like it all kind of starts filling in, is Monsanto. I knew this. Monsanto, starting in the 80s, has spent billions of dollars buying up seed companies. So Monsanto, which was originally a chemical company selling pesticides and herbicides, went into the seed business. So they bought billions of dollars worth of seed companies, and they control most of the corn germplasm in the Western Hemisphere. They bought Seminis, which is a Mexican company that was a conglomerate, and so they now control most of the vegetable seed available for sale in the Western Hemisphere. So the other thing that I didn't realize that I learned recently was, you get into this tangle with Monsanto, they can refuse to sell you seed. And, for a lot of this seed, they're the only game in town. And they want the genetically engineered seed out there because it's a higher premium. And farmers because this seed is patented, farmers can't replant it. So every year they have to go back and buy it. And farmers, there used to be protections for farmers, for breeders. They used to be able to have a license so that if they bred something, they would be protected. Somebody couldn't go off and, get their seed and resell it. But what the exception to that was that farmers could replant those seeds, they could trade them with other farmers, and people could research them. So it kept the whole seed thing open, But with these new utility patents, which is different than this plant protection license that used to started, decades ago. It's a new deal. People can't replant it, and they have to keep going back. And it's a utility patent, and That's why this, in the whole patenting of life and patenting of DNA and patenting of human genes and patenting of animals. So they really are controlling it. And the situation with Monsanto is that I've heard a story I know that like a farmer in Nebraska who has a certain kind of soybean that they want to plant, that they've planted for years, that works well for them. The Monsanto salesperson, who's usually, some good old boy that, they've dealt with for years, comes and the guy says, I would like this certain kind of soybean that I've been growing for years. And they said, well, we have that, but now it's genetically engineered. So if you want that, you're going to have to take the genetically engineered one. So even some farmers that were started off against GE, didn't want it, were pretty much forced to grow GE because there's not enough non-GE soy for everybody that wants to grow it. There's not enough organic soy for all the companies that want to source it. So it's got a really complex issue, but there's all these like weird like connections. You kind of see what a sort of insidious takeover it is of food,
Right, and companies like Monsanto are buying up and patenting both the GMO as well as the natural seeds.
That's right, yeah. So once they control the seed supply, they can hold back whatever they want. They have no obligation to let out seeds. And so it does make you wonder, here's a company whose primary business was, and for a large part still is, chemicals, pesticides and herbicides. So it's not to their advantage to let out a seed that does really well and doesn't need pesticides and herbicides, it's their advantage to let out a seed like the Roundup Ready that's genetically engineered, that's designed to be used with a chemical. So it's a different, story. And then, what is Roundup? What is happening to our land with these millions and millions of acres of Roundup being sprayed, killing the fertility of the soil, turning it from a live thing into a dead thing.
So one of the tactics that it appears that Monsanto and the other mega corporations is using is singling out these farmers, where these farmers don't realize that it's all the other farmers are getting targeted by Monsanto as well. And so it sounds like it's kind of a divide and conquer tactic that appears to be working.
Yeah, there's a few things around that, and one of the things Monsanto has done is asked farmers to rat on other farmers. If they think that a farmer's growing GE, that GE crops, genetically engineered crops, and they haven't paid for it, then they should rat on them, and then they'll get a leather jacket, or they'll get extra special something. So that's a problem. And also the other thing is that when these farmers do settle, they're not supposed to talk about it, and they're not supposed to tell anybody about it. So they sign an agreement not to talk about the settlement, or even, I don't know, I think maybe even that they even got a letter. But yeah, so it is, and it creates this, it does tend to create factions in the farming community, because people that are targeted for it, and we have a case in the film, Rodney Nelson, big soy farmer in North Dakota, who's just, both he and Percy, they weren't organic farmers. They were just regular, they used chemicals, and, they were not the slightest bit, radical or, anything like that. They're just regular farmers. They're just doing their job. And Rodney's family got served with a lawsuit, and so they fought it because they knew they had used GE in some of their fields, but they didn't use it in all their fields. They have like a 2,000 or 3,000 acre farm there. And so they fought it when they got their letter because they knew they hadn't done it. And they're very, very straight, totally square, and they fought it, and then, and it created a lot of, and so in the community, as Rodney says in the film, people would look at them and think, oh, what did they do wrong? Why are they being sued? They must have done it. Did they do it? Didn't they do it? Are they being dishonest? All this stuff where they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything. And so they finally settled. But they weren't allowed to talk about the conditions of their settlement, but he still talks about what happened to him. He just can't talk about what happened in his settlement. But he's spoken out, and we have him in the film, and he's very eloquent. And he's just, and he really, he thought that activists, my understanding of it is that he, before this happened to him, he thought activists and this, he thought they were just really way out there. And now he's become, he's really seeing it all in a different light, because he sees, and this whole loss of independence of the farmer, and we deal with that a lot in the film, how farmers are getting squeezed because the corporations that control the inputs, the seeds and the chemicals and the fertilizers and all the machinery and everything, they're these huge multi-billion-dollar corporations that can really control what goes on, like controlling the seed supply. And then on the other side, who they sell to is bigger and bigger billion-dollar corporations. So the farmer in the middle is getting squeezed. They're getting squeezed because the inputs, they can charge whatever they want, and then, the farmers they can't sell their crop for what it costs for them to grow it. So, we subsidize it. So the whole system is bizarre. And the other thing that maybe people don't realize is that 80% of the grain, the corn and soy that's grown in the United States is sold to feed animals. And, that's fine. I mean, I actually don't eat meat myself, but I do eat salmon, wild salmon. But we just need to start thinking about how much water we're using up doing that, how many chemicals, how many pesticides and herbicides and fungicides we're putting into the soil, that it's contaminating our water supply, and all the oil that's used up, and all this agricultural machinery, and then shipping this stuff all over the place and processing it. And, you just kind of wonder if people thought again, and it's all subsidized. It's all subsidized. That's why McDonald's can sell a hamburger for $1. And the interesting thing that didn't get out in the news much for this Katrina thing, although I thought of it and then I read it somewhere and I think this must be true. There's this area down off New Orleans called the Dead Zone, and what happens is that after the growing season, all the chemicals that have been used all on either side of the Mississippi, all the way up the Mississippi, all drain into the Mississippi, and pesticides, herbicides, all the stuff, and drains down and clogs up with silt in the bay off of New Orleans, in the Gulf of Mexico off of New Orleans, and they call it the dead zone because it's absolutely dead. There's nothing alive in it because that's what these things do. They kill. And so it washes out there, and it's just giant. It's just like as big as the state of Rhode Island. And it's floating there like below the surface, all clogged up there. And what I read, and I believe this is true, is that because that's there right underneath the surface, when Katrina hit, the water above it, the several feet of water above it, because there was this mass of stuff below it, it created this extra warm water where the heat got heated up and it couldn't disperse down into the water because here was this mass that was like collecting the heat. So the water temperature above this dead zone was like, I don't know, it's like I read it's like 98 degrees or something. I mean, it was even more than just global warming. I mean, specifically the result of the kind of agriculture that's taking place all along the Mississippi Valley. So when this Katrina storm came in and it hit this hot water, as we know, that makes the storms more powerful and I think added to the destruction, turned it into a higher rated storm. So, and that's something that people didn't come out, global warming, and that obviously global warming is very important. But here's a very specific thing that's right there that you can point to say, wow, what would have been different if that bay had been healthy, if it hadn't been, packed with this dead zone. That's what they call it. They call it the dead zone. So that was, so that's obviously having an effect on our citizens and our economy and we're the ones that are going to have to pay to get New Orleans back on its feet. So there are consequences of all this stuff. There are consequences, and I think people need to start becoming aware of that and then deciding whether we want to continue that, because that's not going to go away unless, as a society, we decide that we want it to go away.
Well, and as you mentioned, one of the other consequences here is that the farmers, the small family farmers, who, if you go back in history, are the ones that care for the seeds, that pass on the seeds, and I was blown away in your film by reminding me the number of varieties of different things in different countries. 100 different types of rice in China?
Hundreds, yeah.
Hundreds. All the different types of things, potatoes, how many varieties there are of that, and how these are being wiped out by these monocultures.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge a huge issue is that we've lost an enormous number of all the different kinds of plants that were grown at the beginning of the 20th century are gone. They're lost. And they basically grow just a few kinds of big industrial crops, the kind that, so the thing that's, so this idea of diversity and diversity in seeds being a good thing, I know coming from the Bay Area, there's this idea of being politically correct, like biodiversity is a good idea because it's politically correct. You want to see all kinds of people, all kinds of things. And that's nice, but this is actually beyond being politically correct, because what happens in the Irish potato famine is a perfect example, is that they were growing one type of potato all over Ireland, and a certain blight hit it, and it destroyed all those potatoes. They were gone. Within a few days, they were destroyed. So there was nothing for people to eat. So they had to go back and find a potato from South America that was naturally resistant to this blight and bring it back and start again. The same with corn in the United States. There was a corn blight, and they had to find a corn, kind of a landrace corn, one of the early, kind of a very highly differentiated kind of corn that originated in Mexico, that they found was naturally resistant to the blight, and then that's what people ate. So the whole idea of keeping all our resources open, that when these diseases and these insects come, if we're doing things right, the way I think it should be done, and the way a lot of plant scientists who, are like-minded, who is that we need to preserve all this diversity, and we need to be growing it out everywhere. And also, we can use science to find out what gene in that plant creates what trait. In other words, if you have corn that's high yielding and corn that's drought resistant, when you cross them, it's great to use science to find out, did that drought resistant gene get in there, and be able to test it right away, mark and test it to see if it got in there, so you don't have to grow it out and provide a drought, do all the things. You just get, so, and then, but you breed them traditionally, but then you use science to see if the breeding that you've done has been effective. And then, so that, I think we need to use science, but unfortunately, which is again another part of the film, is that what's funded now, there's a lot of corporate funding in our academic system today, and so funding that enhances biotechnology, which can be patented, which can make money for the university and the biotech companies. This is what's funded. The organic and sustainable, so far has not been heavily funded, although there's a lot of activity towards that. I know the Kellogg Foundation gave UC Davis, which is an epicenter for biotech, they gave them a huge grant recently to start a sustainable agricultural program, many millions of dollars. So everybody's really excited about that. And when the Farm Bill comes up next year, and they're already starting to have hearings, there are a lot of organic farmers and people interested in sustainable ag, people interested, even young people in the sciences interested in being able to be funded on these alternatives to the corporate, patented, chemical, addicted agriculture. They want to get in there and get some government money in for neutral, for research that benefits everybody instead of research that just benefits, the Monsantos of the world. And that's something that as citizens, again, I think we need to make our voices heard, that we would rather our money go to that than to give a multi-million-dollar rice farmer money and subsidies, rather and to allow small farmers and to allow people who are trying to make the transition to less chemically dependent agriculture to support them in that.
And I know, again, one of the people you had prominent in your film, Ignacio Chapela,
yeah,
had suffered repercussions from his work with criticizing genetically modified organisms.
Yeah, well, Ignacio, we've become friends. He's a professor at Berkeley, and he was the one that went down to Mexico and tested the corn down there and found that it had been contaminated with genetically engineered DNA, even though they weren't supposed to even be planting it there. But it got in there because the farmers who live in Oaxaca, was where this was, is they actually were selling United GE corn from the United States in their government food stores. So people would buy it to eat, and they would plant some because that's what they do. And the reason why the government food stores were filled with US GE corn is because it's cheaper for Mexico to buy our corn, which is subsidized, than it is for them to grow it themselves. It's called dumping. And so it's cheaper for them to buy it from us than to grow it for themselves. So go figure that. And also because other markets don't want our GE corn. Europe doesn't want it. Japan doesn't want it. There are some African countries that don't want it. So that's a great way to get rid of this genetically engineered corn that the farmers have that they can't get rid of. So anyway, he discovered that, and he printed an article. He had an article out in Nature magazine, and Nature magazine, after a few months of all the biotech people freaking out, about, the point was it was there, and what they contested was his interpretation of some of the testing on what was going on inside the genome, which this particular kind of test, which is kind of controversial as to how you interpret the test. So they objected to his interpretation of the test, and so Nature magazine wrote an article. They didn't retract it. We say in the film that they retracted his article. It was peer-reviewed, but actually they didn't retract it. They just wrote saying we should never have published it, And then a few issues later, Nature magazine was filled with, filled with biotech ads. Although Nature Biotech magazine gave my film a positive review. I think it's the first time they'd reviewed a film. They gave the film a positive review, which is really interesting. They said people need to pay attention to this. People need to. This is why this film shows why people are concerned about GE, which was really interesting. Then the next thing for Ignacio is he had actually worked for one of these big biotech companies before he became a professor at Berkeley. So he thinks they have their place, but he doesn't think their place is in academia. So when a big biotech company offered Berkeley a $25 million grant to do specific research that was going to benefit this, this biotech corporation, Ignacio spoke out against it. He said, this shouldn't be here. It'll influence what we do. And so he had just started working there as a professor. But he had to speak out because he actually had worked for that very company, and he thinks it has its place. It just shouldn't be in academia. So when he came up for tenure a few years ago, and they did do the $25 million grant, and they didn't get much out of it. So they didn't hardly patent anything. So it didn't really turn out. So they didn't renew the grant. It went for 5 years, and then that was it. But Ignacio, when he came up for tenure a few years ago, it was yes, 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 all the way up, and all of a sudden, no tenure. So he was out, a lot of people were outraged because his peers, everyone had said yes, 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 and somehow from the powers at the top came down no. Because biotech is big money. It's big money at UC Berkeley. It's big money in the Bay Area. It's big money up here. Maybe you do more computer stuff up here, but that's where the money is, especially with pharmaceuticals. And so he worked with them, he negotiated, and finally sued them. And he sued them, and then after going back and forth a few months with the lawsuit, they actually awarded him tenure several months ago. I think a new chancellor came in and looked at the situation and gave him tenure. And there were a lot of Berkeley alumni who wrote into Berkeley saying, this is really shameful, what's happened to this man. And there was an independent review of his case by a university in Michigan that looked at everything that happened, and they said this is a clear case of bias against him because of, this was unfair, this was unjust, because he, it was tenure, yes, 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 and then all of a sudden. So everyone was really happy for Ignacio that he got tenure. And I was happy for him because he's a wonderful man, and also he's exactly the kind of person that should be influencing young people, because he really understands how biology works. And one of the things he says in the film, which I think is so true, and I think unless you're in that field, you might not even think about this, is that biology used to be a very diverse field, and people were able to explore all kinds of things. And now it's been cut down, it's been pruned down, so they can only do biotech. And that he felt that was a great loss, and that he was fighting against that. And I think his fight is very courageous, and I think it's allowed a lot of people in academia, certainly professors I've met as I've gone around with the film, to stand up and let people know when they've run into tenure problems because they have issues around big, giant, corporate control of agriculture or various environmental things or, the stuff that brings the big money in, if they challenge any aspect of it, what its effect on the environment or human health or whatever, immediately they're troublemakers. They're not, thank you as a society for letting us become aware of this, but you better shut up and get out. Your career is over. And you see this. And we have instances in the film where people have that, and it's like the guy that the guy that researched that the monarch butterfly may be harmed by the genetically engineered corn, the pollen, because the milkweed is near where the corn grows, and he out of Cornell, and he brought out his results, and he was denigrated by the industry, but he was accurate, and that was a big thing. You saw these people marching with all the kids had on monarch butterfly costumes. It was a very wonderfully visual way of people becoming aware of how threatened things are, like the monarch butterflies. Everybody loves them, and they're way down this year. I don't whether whatever, but so people have run into issues, but a lot of them are courageous, and some of them are just they're gone because they didn't get tenure. So now they're, working at some little podunk place, Nowheresville, and, it's too bad because that's exactly what we need. We need neutral analysis of the effect of this stuff and the effect on society as a whole, not just can someone make a lot of money doing it. That really shouldn't be the only question.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have just been talking with filmmaker Deborah Koons Garcia. She is the writer, director, and producer of the new film, The Future of Food, and you can find out more about that at their website, www.thefutureoffood.com.